Chapter 1. The Day the Sky Never Cleared. The sky ended 12 years ago. It didn't go out with the dignity of a sunset, or the violent finality of a terminal scream. There was no glorious explosion, no singular blinding flash of light that people could point to in the history books and say, "That's when the world broke." It didn't work like that. The end of everything was quiet. It was a slow, agonizing surrender, like a breath held in a pair of collapsing lungs until the heartbeat simply stutters and stops. The sun was the first thing we lost. It didn't just vanish, it decayed. One morning it was a brilliant gold, and by the next week, it was nothing more than a pale, sickly smear behind a thickening veil of atmospheric haze. It looked like a bruised eye peering through a dirty window. Then the clouds changed. They lost their fluff, their white innocence, turning into heavy, curdled masses of charcoal and slate. They didn't bring rain, they brought the weight. Then came the ash. At first it was almost beautiful. It drifted down from the heavens like gray snow, coating the world in a silent, velvety blanket. Children ran outside to catch the flakes on their tongues, a mistake they only made once. By the time we realized the snow was actually pulverized stone and tectonic waste, it was already burning our throats. It clogged our lungs like wet cement. It turned the very act of breathing into a gamble. That was before the visitors even arrived. The meteors didn't need to hit the ground to destroy us. They didn't need to leave craters where our cities stood. As they tore through the upper atmosphere, their sheer mass and speed disrupted the delicate clockwork of the planet. Gravity shifted in sickening jolts. Atmospheric pressure spiked and plummeted, shattering eardrums and cracking the glass of skyscrapers. Deep in the Earth's crust, ancient wounds were ripped open. Volcanic chains across the globe erupted in a synchronized chorus of fire and soot. They vomited sulfur and obsidian smoke into an already dying sky, weaving a permanent shroud that the wind could never clear. Day became a rumor passed down from parents to children. Night became our forever. The panic was the loudest part. I remember the sound of it more than the sight. The rhythmic thumping of feet on pavement, the shattering of shop windows, the desperate, high-pitched keening of people who realized there was nowhere left to run. Governments didn't just fall, they dissolved like salt in water. Then, slowly, with the desperate instinct of insects fleeing a rising flood, humanity crawled underground. That's where I grew up. In the belly of a dying world. I was 10 years old when we sealed the tunnels for the last time. I remember standing on the cold concrete platform, my hands swallowed by my mother's trembling grip. The massive steel doors, built for a war we never had, began to slide shut. The sound was a tectonic shriek, metal grinding against metal in a way that felt like it was tearing my teeth out of my gums. I remember looking up at my mother, her face illuminated by the last sliver of the surface world. "Mama," I whispered, "when do we see the sun again?" She didn't answer. She couldn't. She just stared at the closing door until the light vanished, replaced by the flickering artificial hum of the emergency lights. She died 2 years later. It was the ash rot, the sickness that took everyone who had breathed too much of the surface air before the doors closed. It turns the lungs into petrified stone, a slow suffocation that leaves you gasping for air that your body can no longer process. Most of the adults followed her within the first 5 years. The rest of us, the children of the dark, had to learn how to survive without them. We learned to repair the air scrubbers by touch. We learned which mushrooms were food and which were poison. We learned that hope was a luxury we couldn't afford. Now, I'm 22. And the underground is dying. The silence of the tunnels is no longer peaceful, it's expectant. The generators don't hum anymore. They cough and shudder, their iron hearts failing after a decade of overtime. The air recyclers are losing the battle. Every breath I take tastes of wet rust and the recycled sweat of 5,000 people. Food rations were cut again this morning. A thin, tasteless gray paste for breakfast. A watery, saltless soup for dinner. The tunnels that once felt like a sanctuary now feel like a grave. We're slowly digging for ourselves. People fight over scraps. They whisper in the corners of the communal mess halls. They watch each other with hollow, hungry eyes, wondering who will be the first to break. We were never meant to live like this forever. We were meant to wait for the sky to clear. But the sky hasn't cleared, and today, that truth finally forced us back to the surface. Jail. The voice was low, cutting through the rhythmic thrum hiss of the air filtration unit. I didn't look up immediately. I was busy tightening the rubber strap of my oxygen mask, ensuring the seal was airtight against my cheeks. My fingers were steady, but my heart was a frantic drum against my ribs. Riven stood at the mouth of the tunnel. In the dim, orange glow of the emergency lights, he looked like a statue carved from shadow. He used to be the boy who could find a joke in a famine. He used to smile so wide you'd forget we were half a mile under the dirt. These days his mouth was a hard line. his jaw perpetually set as if he were bracing for an impact that never came. "They're ready," he said. They. The scavenging party. The four of us. The ones the council deemed expendable enough to risk, capable enough to succeed. Meaning we were the last chance. If we didn't find supplies, real food, medical filters, anything to keep the tunnels going, the doors wouldn't need to stay closed much longer. There would be no one left inside to keep them shut. I nodded, my throat tight. I stood up, slinging my heavy canvas pack over my shoulder. It felt lighter than it should, an empty vessel waiting for a miracle. As I moved, my fingers brushed the small chipped knife strapped to my thigh. It was dull, better suited for prying open crates than self-defense, but the weight of it was a comfort. The flashlight clipped to my belt flickered, a dying heartbeat of yellow light, before I slapped it back into submission. Beside me, Mara was adjusting her gloves for the 10th time. Her eyes were wide, darting toward the darkness of the upper shafts, never meeting mine. She was the best mechanic we had, but her nerves were fraying like an old cable. Chet leaned against the damp stone wall, chewing on a piece of synthetic resin, pretending his hands weren't shaking. We'd known each other since we were toddlers. We'd shared the same cramped bunks, the same stories of green grass and blue water, stories that felt more like fairy tales with every passing year. I trusted them. I'd bled for them in the tunnel scuffles. I'd shared my half rations with them when the hunger got too sharp. That was my first mistake. The great steel doors of the access shaft groaned as the manual cranks began to turn. The sound was a physical weight, a dirge played on rusted iron. As the seal broke, a breath of stale, warm air rushed upward, like the underground itself was exhaling us, a long overdue sigh of relief to be rid of the burden of our lives. Then, the cold hit. It wasn't just cold. It was a biting, predatory chill that smelled of metallic dust and ancient sulfur. It stung the back of my throat, even through the mask. "Helmets on," Riven ordered. His voice was muffled by his own respirator. We clicked the reinforced glass visors into place. Rules kept you alive. Don't breathe the air. Don't touch the ash with bare skin. Stay in line. Those were the commandments of the tunnels. The climb up the access shaft took nearly an hour. Every rung of the ladder was a battle. My muscles burned, the lactic acid screaming in my thighs, but I didn't stop. Every echo of our boots against the metal felt too loud, a dinner bell for a world we no longer understood. The air thinned as we climbed, the pressure shifting until my head throbbed in time with my pulse. When we finally reached the top and pushed open the final hatch, the surface greeted us like a corpse long forgotten. The city was still there. That was the shock of it. In my mind, I had imagined it leveled, wiped clean like a chalkboard. But the skeletons remained. Skyscrapers loomed out of the swirling black smog like the ribcages of giants, their windows shattered and dark, looking like hollow eyes. The ash was everywhere. It was a foot deep on the streets, softening the edges of rusted cars and burying the sidewalks. It swallowed the sound of our movements, creating a silence that wasn't peaceful. It was heavy, expectant. It felt like the world was holding its breath, waiting for us to make a mistake. The sky above was a roiling, chaotic blanket of black. It didn't look like clouds anymore. It looked like an ocean of ink, churning slowly in a wind we couldn't feel on the ground. No stars, no moon. Just a crushing, absolute darkness, pressing down on the ruins. For a long moment, none of us moved. We just stood there, four ghosts in a graveyard of a civilization. Then Chet exhaled, a shaky, wet laugh that crackled through our comms. "Still standing." "Look at that. The old world's still standing." "Barely," Riven muttered. "Keep your eyes open." We move in diamond formation. Don't let your flashlights wander. We moved carefully, our boots crunching softly against the ash-covered pavement. Every shadow looked like a threat. Every groan of a swaying sign felt like a warning. The silence was wrong. It felt like a predator lying in wait. We turned a corner onto what used to be a main thoroughfare. And that's when we saw it. The convenience store. The sign above the door was faded, hanging crookedly by a single rusted wire, but the letters were still readable. Miller's Market. The glass doors were cracked, spiderwebs of fractures reaching toward the handles, but they were remarkably intact. And through the thick layer of grime on the windows, our flashlights caught the glint of something impossible. Shelves, full shelves. Real food, canned vegetables with labels that hadn't completely rotted away. Sealed plastic bags of snacks. Bottled water, clear and pristine inside its PET armor. Mara gasped, the sound a sharp intake of air over the radio. Riven swore under his breath, a low, reverent sound. We didn't walk, we rushed. Adrenaline, hot and wild, drowned out the caution we'd spent 12 years cultivating. We kicked through the glass, the sound of the shatter feeling like an explosion in the dead quiet. Inside, the air was stale, smelling of dust and old plastic, but it was a treasure chest. I grabbed cans at random, peaches, beans, soup, stuffing them into my pack until the seams strained and the straps bit into my shoulders. Every can felt like a year of life. Every bottle of water was a miracle. This could keep the whole sector alive for months, I whispered, my voice thick with emotion. For years, Chet said. He was holding a box of crackers as if it were made of solid gold. We won't ever have to eat that paste again. That was when I noticed it. The shift in the air. The way the silence changed. Riven wasn't looking at the shelves anymore. He was looking at me. Mara and Chet had stopped moving, their packs already overflowing. I turned to Riven, a smile forming behind my mask. We need to get back. If we start now, we can. The world exploded into white light and searing pain. The blow caught me across the back of my head, right at the base of my skull. I hit the linoleum floor hard, the impact jarring my teeth. My flashlight skittered across the floor, its beam spinning wildly, illuminating the dust motes in the air like tiny sparks before it settled, pointing away from me. The world was spinning. Nausea surged in my throat. I tried to push myself up, but my arms felt like lead. Through the haze of my blurred vision, I saw them. They weren't panicking. They weren't looking for a threat. They were working. Riven stepped over my prone body, as if I were nothing more than a fallen mannequin. He grabbed the straps of my pack, bracing his boot against my shoulder to rip it free from my arms. I heard the fabric groan and snap. He tossed my bag to Chet, who caught it with a grunt. Check the expiration dates on the back shelf, Riven ordered, his voice echoing in the hollow store. He didn't even look down at me. Mara was at the far end of the aisle, sweeping entire rows of canned goods into a large burlap sack they had hidden under their coats. The sound was rhythmic. Clink, clink, clink. The sound of my life being weighed and traded. We can't carry it all, Mara said, her voice sounding tinny and far away. We leave the heavy water jugs. Focus on the proteins and the medical kits. I tried to reach out, my fingers brushing Riven's boot. Riven, please. He paused, finally looking down. His eyes were cold behind the glass of his visor. The math doesn't work, Jael. 5,000 people eating this? It's a week of life for a dying colony. But for 3 people? It's a lifetime. We're a team, I wheezed, the words slurring. We're survivors, Mara cut in, walking back toward us, her sack bulging with the spoils of the store. The council would just take this and give it to the elders. We're the ones who are actually going to make it. She looked at me for a heartbeat, then looked away, focused instead on adjusting the weight of her stolen goods. She reached down and snatched my extra filter cartridges from my belt, shoving them into her pocket. Chet stood by the door, already loaded down with 3 packs, mine included. He was peering out into the darkness of the street, his body language suggesting he was already miles away. We need to go. The noise will draw things. Riven knelt down. For a fleeting second, I thought he might help me. Instead, his fingers went to the seal of my oxygen mask. No, I pleaded, my voice a broken rasp. Please, Riven, don't. With a sharp rhythmic hiss, he unbuckled the straps. He tore the mask from my face and tossed it into the ash-covered corner of the store. The air hit me immediately. It didn't feel like air. It felt like inhaling ground glass. The sulfur burned my nostrils, and the fine, invisible ash began to coat my throat instantly. I began to cough, racking, violent spasms that made my ribs feel like they were snapping. Goodbye, Jael, Riven said. They turned as one. They didn't look back. I watched from the floor, my eyes stinging, as they walked out into the dark, carrying the food that was supposed to save our people, carrying my life on their backs. The door creaked shut, and I was alone. I lay there for a long moment, my body twitching with the effort to find oxygen in a room full of poison. Panic surged, a hot, wild animal clawing at my chest. I forced myself to roll onto my side, dragging in shallow, burning breaths. Each one felt like a betrayal. Each one brought the rot closer. Move, a voice in my head whispered. It sounded like my mother. If you stay, you die. If you lie here, you're already a ghost. I staggered to my feet, my head throbbing in time with a new, dark rhythm. I stumbled toward the door, my hands sliding against the oily grime of the shelves where the food used to be. I pushed out into the street. The city swallowed me whole. Without my light, the darkness was absolute. It was a physical presence, a heavy velvet curtain that pressed against my eyes. I walked blindly, my hand trailing along the walls of buildings to keep my bearings. Shapes loomed out of the dark. A rusted bus, a fallen street lamp, and vanished just as quickly. Every sound carried strangely. My own footsteps sounded like thunder. My breathing was a ragged, terrifying whistle that seemed to echo off the skeletons of the skyscrapers. I didn't know where I was going. I just knew that if I stopped, The ash would finish what my friends had started. My vision began to fail. Black spots danced at the edges of my sight, merging with the blackness of the sky. My chest felt like it was being crushed by an invisible vice. I was drowning on dry land. Then, I heard it. It wasn't a human sound. It was too smooth. Too rhythmic. Footsteps. But they weren't crunching in the ash. They were clicking, light, fast, and impossibly agile. I froze, my heart hammering so hard I thought it would burst. Hello? My voice was a pathetic, airy shadow of itself. It drifted into the smog and vanished. Something moved on the rooftop above me. A silhouette, darker than the dark, shifted against the roiling clouds. My breath caught. I felt a cold shiver that had nothing to do with the temperature. 2 points of light flared in the darkness. They weren't the yellow of a flashlight or the white of a fire. They were red, a deep, molten crimson that burned with a predatory hunger I had never seen in a human eye. Then more flared. To my left. Behind me. On the rusted fire escape of the building next to me. I ran. I didn't have the strength, but the terror gave me a final, desperate burst of energy. I kicked through the ash, my lungs screaming, my heart a frantic engine of survival. The world tilted. My legs gave out, hitting a hidden piece of rubble. I went down hard, the ash filling my mouth and nose. I tried to crawl, my fingers clawing at the frozen earth. Hands, cold, impossibly strong, and harder than stone, grabbed me. I was lifted off the ground as if I weighed nothing at all. I looked up, and for a split second, a face flashed into view. It was pale, like marble carved in the dark. It was beautiful and monstrous all at once. I saw the flash of white, fangs, sharp and long. I tried to scream, but the air was gone. And then, nothing. When I woke, the air was warm. It was the first thing I noticed. It wasn't just warm, it was clean. I sucked in a deep, instinctive breath, bracing for the burn, the itch, the metallic tang of the surface. It never came. The air was sweet. It tasted of cedar, of old paper, and of something faintly floral that I couldn't name. My eyes snapped open. I wasn't in the tunnels. I wasn't on the ash-choked streets. I was lying on a bed, a real bed, with sheets of silk that felt like water against my skin. Above me, the ceiling was high and vaulted, glowing with a soft, golden light that seemed to emanate from the stones themselves. Luxury. That was the word that surfaced first. It was a word I only knew from the old books, an abstract concept that had no place in the world of gray paste and rust. Then I saw him. He was standing by a massive, floor-to-ceiling window that looked out over the ruins of the city. He was tall, his silhouette sharp and perfectly still. He wore a coat of heavy, dark fabric that seemed to absorb the light around him. His hair was black, brushing his shoulders, and his frame was broad, powerful. He stood with his hands clasped behind his back, watching the roiling black sky as if he were waiting for a friend. Slowly, deliberately, he turned. My breath caught all over again, but this time, it wasn't because of the ash. He was devastatingly handsome, but it was a dangerous beauty, the kind that warned you to stay away, even as it pulled you in. His cheekbones were sharp enough to draw blood. His eyes, now a deep, brooding amber in the low light, seemed to hold a weight of years that no human could survive. His mouth curved into a faint, knowing smile. "You're awake," he said. His voice was like velvet over gravel, smooth, controlled, and ancient. It vibrated in my chest, a sound that felt more like a physical touch than a greeting. I tried to sit up, but the memories crashed back into me like a physical blow. The store. Riven. The red eyes in the dark. I scrambled backward on the bed, my heart hammering against my ribs. What? What are you? He didn't move. He didn't need to. He commanded the space, just by breathing. Something real, he replied calmly, his voice echoing slightly in the vast room. Something you were never meant to meet. My throat went dry. My hand went to my thigh, but my knife was gone. My pack was gone. I was defenseless in a palace made of shadows. Vampires weren't real. They were the stories the elders told us to keep us from wandering too far into the unlit sectors of the tunnels. They were the monsters we blamed for the people who disappeared when the rations got low. They were myths, but as his gaze flicked to my pulse, his eyes darkening for a fraction of a second, with a flicker of that terrifying red, I knew. The surface hadn't just been reclaimed by the mistakes of humanity. It had been claimed by something that had been waiting in the shadows long before the first meteor fell. And I was in its home. Next step. Narrative. Chapter 2. The creature saved me. I came back to consciousness in fragments, like a broken mirror trying to piece itself together in the dark. The first thing that returned was the sound. It wasn't the silence of the store or the whistle of the wind. It was a symphony of violence. I heard the screech of metal tearing, thick, structural steel being shredded like wet paper. Then came something wetter, more final. The sharp, sickening crack of bones snapping under a pressure that no human hand could ever exert. Then came the smell. It hit me before I could even open my eyes. The heavy, cloying scent of hot copper and ancient smoke. It was the smell of a slaughterhouse that had been set on fire. My body was cold. Not the damp, creeping chill that seeped into your bones in the tunnels. This was something sharper. More crystalline. It was a predatory cold, an external force that felt like being pressed against a slab of mountain ice. I tried to scream. My mind sent the command, my throat tensed to deliver the plea, but no sound came out. My vocal cords felt like they were coated in the very ash that had been trying to kill me. I was a hollow shell, a ghost in a body that was no longer responding to its owner. My eyelids fluttered, heavy as if they had been sealed with lead. When they finally dragged open, the world was a nightmare of motion and shadow. The street spun around me in blurred streaks of charcoal and gray. The ash swirled in the air, caught in a violent localized storm. Shapes were moving, too fast for the human eye to track. They were shadows leaping across the skeletal walls of the buildings, claws flashing like obsidian blades, mouths opening wide enough to split faces in half. Vampires. But they weren't the beautiful, tragic lies whispered in the old books we'd scavenged from the ruins. There was nothing romantic about the things in the street. These were wrong. They were twisted, starved things. Creatures that had been abandoned by the sun and left to rot in their own hunger. Their skin was translucent and gray, stretched tight over corded muscle and protruding bone. One of them lunged toward me. I saw the yellowed fangs, slick with a cocktail of saliva and a dark, arterial blood that wasn't mine. I saw the madness in its eyes, a pure, unadulterated need to consume. It never reached me. Something hit it from the side with a sound like a freight train colliding with a wall. The creature didn't just fall, it flew. It slammed into the brick facade of a standing building, with enough force to crater the masonry. I heard the wet thud as its spine shattered. It slid down the wall, limbs twitching in a grotesque, rhythmic dance, and it didn't get back up. The street went deathly still. The other creatures, the smaller, leaner scavengers, froze in mid-crawl. Then he stepped into view. He moved like the darkness itself had parted to grant him passage. He was tall, broader than any man I had seen in the tunnels, wrapped in a long, heavy coat that didn't stir despite the ash-laden wind. His boots made no sound as he crossed the cracked pavement toward me. The red glow from distant, eternal fires reflected faintly in his eyes. But they weren't feral like the others. They were controlled. Calculating. They were ancient. One of the remaining vampires, a spindly thing with patches of hairless scalp, hissed at him, baring its teeth in a desperate display of bravado. "Leave," the man said. The word wasn't a shout. It was a quiet, low-frequency command that seemed to vibrate through the very air. It settled into my chest like a second heartbeat, heavy and undeniable. The creature hesitated. It looked at me, a dying easy meal, and then at the man. It made the wrong choice. It lunged. The man moved so fast, the air itself seemed to crack. One moment he was standing 10 feet away. The next he was in front of the vampire. He didn't use a weapon. He didn't need one. His hand buried itself in the creature's chest with a sharp, wet sound that I felt in my own marrow. The vampire screamed once, a high, thin sound that cut through the smog, and then went limp. With a casual, brutal efficiency, the man ripped his hand free. Clenched in his fist was something dark, steaming and still pulsing with a pathetic, borrowed life. A heart. He dropped it to the ground and crushed it beneath the heel of his boot, without looking down. The remaining vampires didn't wait for another command. They fled, their retreat frantic and panicked, vanishing into the smog-choked alleys like rats fleeing a fire. Silence returned to the ruins, heavier than before. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drum in the quiet. The man turned toward me. I tried to crawl backward, my fingers scraping against the ash, but my limbs refused to obey. My vision began to tunnel, the edges of the world turning black. The cold was winning now. He crouched beside me, moving with a predatory grace. He was close enough that I could see the fine, sharp lines at the corners of his eyes and the perfection of his marble-like skin. He smelled of wood smoke, iron, and something much deeper, the scent of cold stone and forgotten time. "You shouldn't be here," he said. His voice wasn't cruel. It was worse. It was indifferent, yet laced with a strange, magnetic resonance. I felt his hand slide beneath my neck. His fingers were surprisingly gentle, though the skin was as cold as the air. He lifted my head slightly, his thumb brushing my jawline, tilting my face toward the faint, amber light filtering through the perpetual gloom. His gaze fixed on my throat. I knew what he was looking at. I knew the stories. He was looking at the vein, the life force thrumming just beneath the surface, desperate and terrified. I knew what he could do to me. I knew he could finish what the ash had started. Fear surged through me, sharp and electric. And beneath it, something traitorous and confusing stirred. A strange, primal awareness. My pulse jumped wildly, betraying my terror, and something else I couldn't name. His jaw tightened. For a split second, something flickered across his face. A flash of hunger, yes, but also a staggering display of restraint. It was a control wound so tight it felt like a coiled spring. "Easy," he murmured. I wasn't sure if he was talking to me or to the beast inside himself. My lungs burned. I gasped, my fingers clutching weakly at the heavy fabric of his coat. It was the first thing I had touched in 12 years that didn't feel like it was falling apart. "Air!" I croaked. The word was a splinter in my throat. He cursed under his breath, a low sound of irritation. In one smooth, effortless motion, he lifted me into his arms. I should have fought him. I should have clawed at his eyes, screamed for the tunnels, demanded he let me go. But I didn't. His body was solid and unyielding, a pillar of ice in a world of smoke. Somehow, in the arms of a monster who had just ripped a heart from a chest, I felt safer than I had since the steel doors of the underground had closed behind me. The last thing I saw before the darkness claimed me again was his face bent close to mine, his eyes glowing with a faint amber light in the eternal night. "Don't die," he said quietly. Then the world vanished. I dreamed of the sun. It wasn't the sun I'd seen as a child. This was a dream sun, a vast, golden eye that watched me from behind clouds that never quite parted. I stood in a field of green, something I'd only ever seen in the faded photographs of the tunnel libraries. I reached upward, my hands trembling, trying to touch the warmth. Then, the shadows began to stretch. They crept across the grass like ink spilled on silk. A cold finger brushed my wrist. I woke with a sharp, ragged inhale. The air. That was the first thing I noticed. It was clean. It was impossibly, miraculously clear. I took a deep breath, and for the first time in my life, I didn't taste dust or rust or the recycled breath of 5,000 people. It was cool and smelled of cedar and rain. I bolted upright, my heart racing, only to be stopped by a pair of hands on my shoulders. They weren't gripping me, but they were firm enough to act as an anchor, preventing me from falling back onto the pillows. "Slowly," a voice said. The same voice. The velvet and the gravel. I froze, my muscles locking. The room around me came into focus, piece by piece. It was a space that shouldn't exist. The ceilings were high, vaulted with dark wood. The walls were smooth, pale stone, lit by soft golden panels that seemed to be part of the architecture itself. I was in a bed, a real bed, beneath blankets of thick, heavy fabric that felt like a caress. I was clean. The soot was gone from my skin. The grit was gone from under my fingernails. Even more terrifying, my clothes had been changed. The heavy, reinforced rags of the scavenging party were gone, replaced by a soft, charcoal gray tunic that felt like silk against my skin. Panic flared, hot and sharp. I twisted, trying to wrench myself away from the touch, and the hands released me immediately. They didn't fight me, they simply vanished. I scrambled backward until my spine hit the padded headboard of the bed. I pulled the blankets up to my chin, my breath coming in short, panicked bursts. "Don't touch me." He stepped back into the soft light. He had removed the long coat, and now he stood in a dark, form-fitting shirt that showed the lean, powerful lines of his chest and shoulders. He raised his hand slightly, a gesture that might have been meant to reassure me, but in a room this beautiful and this silent, it felt like a mockery of my fear. "You're safe," he said. I laughed, the sound sharp and hysterical in the quiet room. "Safe? I saw what you did out there. You killed them. You killed them with your bare hands." "Yes," he said, his voice flat. "You're one of them. You're one of those things." His mouth curved faintly, a gesture that wasn't quite a smile. It was more like the ghost of one. "Also, yes." I wrapped my arms around myself, suddenly aware of how exposed I felt despite the blankets. The room was too large, too open. There were no bars on the windows, no chains on my ankles, no locks that I could see. But I knew the truth. Monsters didn't need cages when they believed the world outside was their own hunting ground. "Where am I?" I asked, my voice trembling. "My home," he answered. He spoke the words with a quiet pride, as if the concept of a home wasn't a death sentence in the world above. I scanned the room again. It was filled with things I'd only heard of in the old stories. Real books. A desk made of solid, dark wood. A rug that looked like it was woven from silver thread. "What do you want?" I asked, my voice rising. "Why did you bring me here? Why didn't you just leave me for the others?" He studied me in silence for a long moment. His gaze was slow, assessing, not leering like a common predator, but thorough, like a general measuring the terrain before a campaign. He was looking at me as if I were a riddle he hadn't quite solved yet. "Answers," he said finally. To what? I don't have anything. My team took everything. They took the food, the filters. I have nothing. I don't care for your canned goods, Jay said, and the mouth sent a shiver down my spine. I want to know why your blood smells the way it does. My stomach dropped. I felt the blood drain from my face. I don't know what you're talking about. He moved then. He didn't walk. He glided, crossing the room in long, effortless strides until he stood directly in front of the bed. He was too close. I could feel the cold radiating off him like a draft from an open tomb. I could see the faint, rhythmic rise and fall of his chest. A habit, I realized, not a necessity. He didn't need to breathe, but he was doing it to put me at ease. Or perhaps to catch my scent again. He leaned down, bracing one hand against the headboard beside my shoulder. He didn't touch me, but he had boxed me in. I was trapped between the bed and the shadow of a king. I've existed for a very long time, he said softly. His voice was a low vibration that seemed to hum in my very bones. Long enough to see empires rise and turn to dust. Long enough to know when something rare, something impossible, crosses my path. My heart pounded so hard, I was sure he could hear it. He probably could. He leaned closer, his eyes darkening. He inhaled slowly, deeply, his nostrils flaring slightly. I saw the muscles in his neck tighten, and for the first time since I woke up, the fear gave way to something else. Something hot, unsettling, and entirely too powerful. It was a curl of awareness low in my stomach, a strange pull toward the very thing that should have terrified me. It was the lure of the abyss. You should be dead, he continued, his voice dropping to a whisper. Your lungs were failing. Your blood oxygen was at a level that should have triggered a coma. And yet, his gaze dropped to my throat, to the pulse jumping frantically in the hollow of my neck. You survived the ash. Your body didn't just endure it, it fought it back. Your blood, it is vibrant. It is clean. In a world of rot, you are a miracle. I swallowed hard, my throat dry. I'm just a scavenger. I'm nobody. He straightened abruptly, taking a step back, as if he had caught himself standing too close to a fire. The predatory hunger in his eyes was replaced by a cold, sharp discipline. You're not a blood slave, he said, the words cutting through the air like a knife. Not yet. The not yet hung in the air between us, a heavy, looming promise. My name is Helios, he said. The name settled into the room like a weight of gold. It was a name of the sun, a name of light, held by a creature of the absolute dark. And yours? He asked, though I knew he already knew. Jael, I whispered. He repeated it once, quietly. He didn't just say it. He tasted it, the syllables rolling off his tongue with a dangerous sort of reverence. Rest, Jael, Helios said, his voice regaining its aristocratic distance. We will speak again soon. There is much to discuss regarding your future. Wait, I blurted out, reaching a hand toward him before pulling it back. You can't just leave me here. You can't just... What happens now? I can, he interrupted gently. And I will. You are exhausted, and your body is still healing from the toxins. My servants will bring you food. Real food. Eat. Sleep. Do not try to leave the room. The spire is unkind to guests who wander. He turned toward the door, his long shadow stretching across the floor. As the door, a seamless slab of dark stone, began to slide open soundlessly, I found my voice one last time. It was a question that had been burning in the back of my mind since the street. Why didn't you kill me? I asked. If my blood is so rare, why am I sitting here in silk? Why aren't you just taking what you want? He paused, his back to me. He stood framed in the doorway, the light from the corridor casting his silhouette in sharp, jagged lines. Because, he said, his voice echoing slightly as he looked back over his shoulder. The amber in his eyes flared with a brief, terrifying heat. Because, Jael, you are far more valuable alive. A fountain is always better than a cup. The door closed behind him with a soft, final hiss. I sank back against the pillows, my body shaking with a delayed reaction to the terror. I looked at my hands, clean, soft, and trembling. Above ground, beneath an artificial sky, in the lair of a monster who had saved my life only to claim it for his own. I finally understood the truth of the world we had left behind. The darkness hadn't just swallowed the earth 12 years ago. It hadn't just destroyed civilization. It had crowned kings, and one of them had decided that I belonged to him. Chapter 3. The Price of Breath. I didn't sleep. Sleep was a luxury for those who hadn't been traded for a handful of canned peaches. I lay awake on the bed, his bed, and listened to the ghost sounds of the spire. The silence here was fundamentally different from the silence of the tunnels. Underground, silence was a heavy, claustrophobic thing, thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, wet rust, and the distant rhythmic thrum of air scrubbers that were older than I was. Silence in the tunnels meant people were holding their breath, waiting for the next ration cut or the next generator failure. But here, the silence was sharp. It was a polished, mechanical quiet, broken only by the faint melodic hum of the dome's life support systems. It was the sound of absolute, unquestioned control. Ownership. I stared at the ceiling for hours, my eyes tracing the golden veins of light that pulsed like a slow heartbeat within the stone. Every breath I took felt like a miracle and a sin. My lungs no longer rattled. The constant, low-grade headache that had defined my life since the ash sickness took my mother was gone. I felt clean, efficient. I should have been drowning in gratitude. I should have been weeping with relief. Instead, I felt like a lamb that had been washed and groomed, only because the wolf preferred a clean meal. I was alive because Helios hadn't decided I was better off dead. Yet, when the door finally moved, I didn't hear the motor. I felt the shift in the room's pressure first, a subtle weight that made the hair on my arm stand up. The air tensed, as if the room itself were acknowledging its master. Helios entered with the quiet confidence of a man who owned the very atoms of the air. He had removed the heavy outer coat he wore in the streets. Now he wore a dark, charcoal-colored tunic, made of a fabric that seemed to absorb the light. It clung to the broad, powerful frame of his shoulders and chest, the sleeves rolled back to his forearms. His skin was the color of unpolished marble, but as he moved closer, I saw them. Scars. Thin, silver lines crisscrossed his forearms, deep, jagged marks that spoke of old wars and even older grudges. It was the first sign of vulnerability I had seen. He wasn't a god. He was a soldier who had survived long enough to become a king. That realization sent a confusing, traitorous ripple through me. I didn't want him to be human adjacent. I wanted him to be a statue. "You're awake," he said. It wasn't a question. He could probably hear the frantic rhythm of my heart from across the room. "I wasn't asleep," I replied, my voice sounding small and brittle against the vastness of the chamber. His mouth twitched, a micro-movement that hinted at a smile without ever committing to one. "Of course you weren't. You're waiting for the other shoe to drop." He moved to a high-backed chair carved from the same dark stone as the walls and sat, folding one leg over the other with casual authority. He didn't slouch. He sat with a predatory stillness, his amber eyes fixed on me, as if I were the only interesting thing in a dead world. "I imagine you have questions," he said, his voice a low, melodic baritone. "I imagine you have answers," I shot back. I sat up, pulling the heavy blankets around me like a shield. His gaze sharpened, a flash of something dark and ancient flickering behind his pupils. "Careful, Jael. Gratitude may be too much to ask for, but civility is a low bar." The warning wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It had the weight of a mountain behind it. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to sit straighter. If I showed him only fear, he would treat me like the others. If I wanted to survive, I had to be something more than a victim. "Those things in the street," I said, my voice steadier. "The ones you disposed of." "What were they?" "Feral," Helios replied calmly, as if he were discussing a weather pattern. "They didn't look like they belonged in a city," I said. "They looked like animals. I grew up hearing stories, rumors from the deep shafts that things were living in the ruins. We thought it was just the ash sickness making people see ghosts. We thought people were just going crazy from the dark." "They are not ghosts," Helios said, his eyes narrowing. "And they are not human. Not anymore." "Then what are they?" "What are you?" I demanded. Before the meteors, before the sky stayed black, vampires were they were movies, myths, make-believe stories for children. But you're standing here. You're real." Helios leaned forward slightly, resting his scarred forearms on his thighs. The movement brought him closer to the light, and I could see the golden flecks in his eyes. "Myth is just a word for history that has been forgotten or suppressed," he said. "We have always been here, Jael. We moved in the margins. We lived in the corners of your world, feeding enough to survive, but never enough to be noticed. We were the shadows you ignored because your world was too bright to see us." He gestured to the window, toward the roiling black clouds outside. "But when the sky darkened 10 years ago, the lights went out. Your world became ours. The margins grew until they covered the earth." My stomach twisted at the imagery. I thought of the empty buildings I'd seen, the skeletons of a world that hadn't just died, but had been reclaimed by its nightmares. "When the sun became poison to you," he continued, "it became a blessing to us. Many of my kind believed it was our hour of ascension. They came out of hiding in the thousands. They fed freely. Too freely. They forgot that we are not just consumers. We are part of an ecosystem. They drank the cities dry, and in doing so, they drank themselves into madness. Blood is not just sustenance to us, Jael," he said, his voice dropping an octave. "It is memory. It is emotion. It is identity. To drink without control, to gorge on the terror of a dying world, is to lose oneself in the static. They became husks, creatures of pure instinct. That is what attacked you. And you? I asked, the question slipping out before I could stop it. What did you choose when the world ended? His eyes locked onto mine, and for a moment, the amber felt like molten gold. Power, he said. The honesty of it was a physical blow. He didn't say justice or mercy. He said power. I chose survival through structure, he continued. I built the spire. I gathered those with the discipline to resist the madness. I created rules. Order. Without them, my kind is a virus that kills its host. With them, we are a civilization. And humans? I asked, my anger flaring. Where do we fit into your perfect order? Are we just the host? A long, heavy pause followed. The hum of the room seemed to grow louder. Beneath us, he said evenly. The word landed like a slap. It was the cold, hard truth of the world above. Then why save me? I demanded, throwing the blankets aside and standing up. I felt small in the gray tunic, but I refused to stay down. If I'm just a resource, why the silk? Why the clean air? Why not just put me in a pen with the others? Helios stood as well. He didn't rush, but his movement was so fluid it made me feel clumsy. He crossed the room, stopping just a few inches from me. He was a wall of cold, dark energy. He smelled of rain-drenched earth and something metallic, like the air before a lightning strike. Because, he said, leaning down so his face was level with mine, you are not beneath me in the way the others are. My pulse jumped traitorously, a rhythmic pounding in my ears that he was undoubtedly tracking. He lifted his hand. I froze, my breath hitching in my chest. I expected the cold grip of his fingers on my throat. Instead, his hand stopped just short of contact. His fingers hovered over my skin, close enough that I could feel the chill radiating off him. Your blood, he murmured, his gaze dropping to the vein in my neck. It carries a resonance. Something old. Something deep. I clenched my fists, my nails digging into my palms. I didn't choose my blood. I'm just a tunnel scavenger. No, he agreed softly, his voice a vibration that seemed to move through my skin. But I did. I chose you the moment I smelled the copper on the wind 3 streets away. You descend from a line that once mingled with mine. Long before the meteors. Long before the tunnels, you carry the markers of a bridge. I stared at him, my head spinning. That's impossible. We're 2 different things. You're a monster, and I'm a person. Nothing is impossible in a world where the sun has been blotted out by ash, Jael, he replied. He dropped his hand, but he didn't move back. He stayed in my space, his presence a weight I couldn't push away. What does that mean for me? I asked, my voice trembling. It means, he said, his eyes locking onto mine with an intensity that made my knees weak, that you can survive something no ordinary human can. Your body can process the ascension, the transition of power, without shattering. The air in the room felt suddenly electric. No, I said immediately, backed by a sudden, sharp intuition. Whatever you're thinking, whatever bargain you've made in your head, no. A slow, dark smile curved his mouth. It wasn't a kind smile. It was the smile of a gambler who knew exactly what cards were in my hand. You don't even know what I'm offering yet. I don't need to, I snapped, my heart thundering. I've heard the rumors, people disappearing from the outposts. We thought it was just the dark taking them, but it was you, wasn't it? You were taking people to feed on. His eyes darkened, the amber turning to the color of old blood. I do not need to hunt in the outposts, Jael. My city provides. But I am not looking for a meal in you. That made my stomach sink even further. In the tunnels, being a meal was a threat you could understand. But there were words for things that were worse than being eaten. Helios turned away, pacing toward the massive window. Beyond the glass, the city of the spire was a marvel of dark architecture and glowing violet lights. It looked like a dream of the future, built on the bones of the past. My kind is dwindling, Jael, he said, his back to me. The feral ones burn out and die. The controlled ones, we are a dying breed. We are stagnant, 10 years of this darkness. And we have done nothing but maintain the status quo. He turned back to face me, his silhouette framed by the dead city behind him. I require an heir, a true successor, who can bridge the gap between what we were and what we must become to survive this world. The words hung in the air, heavy and irrevocable. I laughed, a short, sharp sound of disbelief. You're insane. You want me to... What? You're talking about a child? I am talking about a future, he corrected calmly. I am talking about a legacy that can walk in both worlds. A child of the spire, born of the strongest blood on the surface and the purest blood of the dark. The world tilted. I felt the floor swaying beneath my feet. "No," I whispered. "You will," he said. It wasn't a threat. It was a statement of fact, as certain as the rising of the tide. I stood my ground, my hands shaking. "You said I wasn't a slave. You said I was safe here." "You are safe," Helios replied, stepping back toward me. "You would be the most protected being in this city. You would be essential. You would be a queen in all but name." "That's worse," I shouted, my voice breaking. "You're talking about using me. You're talking about my body like it's just another resource, like the oxygen or the food in that store. You're just like Riven and the others. You just found a more polite way to take what you want." His gaze sharpened, turning cold and clinical. "And what do you think you already are, Jael? To your people in the tunnels, you were a tool to be used until you broke. To your friends in the store, you were a weight to be discarded the moment the math didn't favor them. At least here, your value is recognized. At least here, you are cherished for the very thing that makes you rare." The words hit me because they were true. They were a knife, twisted in an open wound. I thought of Riven's cold eyes. I thought of Mara taking my oxygen mask and leaving me to drown in the ash. My silence was the only answer I could give. Helios moved closer again, his voice dropping to a seductive, dangerous whisper. "I am offering you a life that no human has lived since the sky fell. I am offering you sunlight, artificial perhaps, but warm. I am offering you safety from the rot. I am offering you autonomy within these walls. No forced feeding, no labor, no pain. And after?" I demanded, looking up at him. "After you have your heir? What happens to the human mother then?" His eyes searched my face. A flicker of something. Was it respect? Crossing his features. "You will be free to leave," he said. "If the world outside is what you truly desire, I will provide you with the means to survive it. Or, you may stay. The choice will be yours, and yours alone." I didn't believe him. Monsters didn't give choices. They gave ultimatums dressed in velvet. "You expect me to trust the word of a creature that kills with his bare hands?" "No," he said, his voice as smooth as polished glass. "I expect you to be rational. I expect you to look at the world out there, the ash, the ferals, the betrayal, and look at what I am offering you here." I closed my eyes, my thoughts a tangled, screaming mess. I hated him. I hated the way he looked at me, like I was a prize to be won. And yet, I hated the way my own body was reacting to him. I was a creature of the tunnels, a creature of survival, and every instinct I had was screaming that this man was the only thing standing between me and the end. "What if I refuse?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Helios's voice dropped, becoming as cold as the frost on the windows. "Then you will be returned to the street where I found you. I will not keep a guest against her will, but I will not provide my heir and my protection to someone who does not wish to be part of my world." The image came instantly, the store, the gasping for breath, the red eyes in the dark, the sound of the feral's claws on the brick as they waited for me to stop moving. "That's not a choice," I whispered. "That's an execution." "It is a choice," he corrected gently. "Just not a pleasant one. Every life is a series of trades, Jael. You've been trading your health for the tunnels for 10 years. Now, I am asking you to trade for something better." I looked at him, this beautiful, terrifying king of the ash. I felt the heat of his presence, the quiet confidence, the restrained violence that lay just beneath the surface of his skin. He was everything I should fear. And yet, as I looked into his amber eyes, I felt a pull that terrified me more than the creatures in the street. "I need time," I said, my voice cracking. "You have until the cycle resets tomorrow," he replied. He began to move toward the door. "Decide carefully, Jael," Helios said, pausing at the threshold. He didn't turn back. "The darkness is very patient, but my city is not. Don't choose a grave just because you're afraid of the light." The door slid shut, leaving me alone in the golden glow of the room. I sank onto the bed, my heart pounding, my skin still tingling where the air around him had touched me. Outside the dome, the world was a graveyard. Inside, a monster was waiting for me to say yes. And the most terrifying truth of all? Part of me, the part that wanted to live, the part that wanted to breathe, already knew what the answer would be. Chapter 4. The Oath and the Curse. I stood at the window long after the shadow of Helios had vanished from the room. Beyond the transparent wall of the dome, the world was a dead thing, frozen in a state of perpetual, agonizing night. The smog didn't just drift, it churned in slow, oily cycles, lit faintly from below by the distant, rhythmic glow of volcanic veins that refused to heal. Somewhere out there, miles beyond this bubble of predatory grace, the feral vampires were prowling. I could almost hear the sound of their claws scraping against the husks of skyscrapers, their minds nothing more than a screaming void of hunger. Somewhere out there, Riven, Mara, and Chet were alive. That thought burned in my gut worse than the ash ever had. They had calculated my death. They had weighed my life against a few extra weeks of canned protein and found me wanting. They had chosen survival at the cost of their humanity, and here I was, standing in silk, weighing a different kind of betrayal. I wasn't betraying them. I was betraying the girl who had believed that the tunnels were the only thing left of the world. I pressed my palm against the glass. It wasn't cold. It was warm. A steady, artificial heat maintained by the spire's massive reactors. Controlled. Safe. Suffocating. The underground had taught me one thing above all else. Survival always came at a cost. Morality was a luxury for people who didn't have to worry about the next breath. Love was a fairy tale for those who had never seen a friend stolen by the rot. Helios hadn't lied to me, not in the way humans lie. He didn't hide his nature behind pretty words or false promises. He was a monster, and he was offering me a monster's bargain. That alone made him more terrifyingly attractive than any man I had ever known. When the door slid open again, I didn't turn around. I didn't need to. I felt the drop in temperature, the sudden, electric stillness that accompanied his presence. "I'll do it," I said quietly. My voice sounded steady, even to my own ears. On my terms. The silence stretched. It was a heavy, expectant thing. I could hear the faint, rhythmic sound of my own pulse, a reminder of the life he wanted to harvest. Then his reflection appeared in the glass beside mine. He was a silhouette of sharp angles and deep shadows. "You don't have terms, Jael," Helios said. His voice was a velvet rasp, devoid of any warmth. "You have a choice between a throne and a grave." I turned slowly to face him. The room felt smaller now that he was in it, as if his gravity were pulling the walls closer. "Then you don't have an heir," I countered. "And if you're as desperate as you sound, that makes my terms very relevant." For the first time, I saw a flicker of something new in his amber eyes. It wasn't anger. It was intrigue. Surprise. He studied me in silence, his gaze heavy and assessing. He walked a slow circle around me, like a wolf deciding where to sink its teeth. The air between us felt charged, a tension so thick it felt like it might snap and draw blood. "Speak," he said finally. He stopped in front of me, his height looming, his scent, rain, iron, and ancient stone, enveloping me. I lifted my chin. My voice shook, but I refused to let it break. "No feeding without my consent. Ever. I am not a livestock animal for your court. No cages, no forced isolation. I want to be able to move through this city. I keep my name. I am Jael, not a possession, and I will not be paraded around like a prize bitch." "And if you attempt to flee?" he asked coolly. He took a step closer, his eyes locked onto mine. "If you try to return to the ash?" "I won't," I replied. "But if I do, if the day comes where I can no longer stand the sight of you, you let me go." "Truly go." A slow, dark smile curved his mouth. It was a dangerous expression, one that promised pleasure and pain in equal measure. "You ask for much for a girl who was dying in the dirt an hour ago," Helios said. "I give you everything," I shot back, stepping into his space until I could feel the cold radiating from his chest. "My body. My future. The bloodline you're so obsessed with." "You don't get my soul for free, Helios." The room felt suddenly, impossibly hot. He stepped even closer. Once, twice, until I was pressed back against the glass of the dome. He leaned in, bracing his hand on the wall beside my head. He didn't touch me, but he didn't have to. The sheer physical presence of him was an assault on my senses. "You are bold for someone so fragile," he murmured. His gaze dropped to my lips, then back to my eyes. "I could break you with a thought, and then you'd be back where you started," I whispered, "alone in a dying world with no future." His eyes burned, not with the red madness of the ferals, but with a molten ancient heat. "I do not need you, Jael," he said, his voice dropping to a vibration that made my skin tingle. "I want you." There is a profound difference. The distinction sent a shiver through me that I couldn't hide. My body was reacting to him against my will, my heart racing, my breath coming in shallow hitches. "You will live in my home," he continued. "Under my shadow, you will want for nothing: food, warmth, safety. And in return, you get your heir," I finished, the words feeling like a vow. "Yes." I exhaled slowly, the tension in my shoulders finally breaking. "Then I agree. The trade is made." Helios didn't move for a long moment. He stayed pinned against me, his eyes searching mine as if he were looking for the lie. Then, he straightened, stepping back and restoring the space between us, but the tension lingered, humming through my veins like a live wire. "Come," he said. "If you are to be part of this world, there are things you must understand. I will not have you walking these halls in ignorance." He led me out of the suite and through corridors of polished obsidian and golden light. We moved deeper into the structure, descending into the heart of the spire. Guards watched us pass. Vampires, all of them. They were beautiful in a terrifying predatory way, their skin like porcelain and their movements too fluid to be human. They bowed as Helios passed, their eyes never leaving me. But they didn't move. None of them touched me. That alone told me how absolute Helios's authority was. In this city, I was protected by the most dangerous creature in existence. We descended into a chamber, unlike the rest of the spire. It was older, darker, the walls carved from raw, unpolished rock. Symbols I didn't recognize were etched into the stone, glowing with a faint, blue phosphorescence. Candles burned in iron sconces, their flames steady and unmoving, casting long shadows that seemed to dance of their own accord. This city, Helios said, his voice echoing in the vast space, was not built by the things we are now. I frowned, looking at the ancient carvings. Then who built it? This looks like it's been here for centuries, long before the meteors. He stopped at the center of the chamber, beneath a domed ceiling that depicted a map of a world I didn't recognize. We built it, he said, before we became what we are, before we traded the sun for the dark. The air shifted, growing heavy with the weight of history. This is where it began, he continued. The order you know as the Knights Templar was not merely a group of religious zealots. We were guardians, seekers of relics, seekers of power that the church deemed too dangerous for the common man. My pulse quickened. The tunnels had libraries, but they were filled with technical manuals and children's stories. This was real history. The church hunted you because you found something. They feared what they couldn't control, Helios replied, his eyes tracing the symbols on the walls. And rightly so. We found something beneath Jerusalem. An altar. A gateway to a power that existed before the first cross was raised. Before Rome was even a dream. A cold knot formed in my stomach. A ritual. Yes. He turned to face me fully. The blue light of the candles made him look like an ancient statue. We sought immortality. We sought the strength to protect the world from its own weakness. We sought protection from death itself. And the dark answered us. It granted us everything we asked for. But at a price, I said, the words feeling heavy in my mouth. Helios's mouth curved into a faint, bitter smile. There is always a price, Jael. The universe is a ledger that must always be balanced. The sun, I guessed. It became your enemy. And the hunger, he confirmed, an endless, unforgiving hunger that never truly sleeps. To drink is to feel alive. To feel the pulse of the world. To restrain is to suffer in a way your kind cannot comprehend. It is like being a man dying of thirst in a room full of water. I thought of the feral vampires I'd seen in the street, the madness in their eyes, the desperation. Those who don't restrain themselves, they lose their minds. They lose everything, he finished. They become nothing more than the hunger. I have spent 800 years ensuring that my city does not become a cage of animals. I have ruled, I have fought, and I have watched civilizations rot and rebuild themselves from the ash. I have loved, and I have buried everyone I ever allowed close. The admission struck me harder than I expected. There was a profound loneliness in his voice, a weariness that spanned centuries. And now? I asked quietly. Now, he said, stepping closer to me again. The world has finally bent to accommodate us. The ash is our shield. The dark is our kingdom. But we are stagnant, Jael. We are a lake with no river. We need new blood. We need a bridge. Silence stretched between us, thick with the weight of his words. You will not be my prisoner, Helios said, his voice regaining its command. But understand this, once the city knows what you are, once you carry the weight of our future, there will be those who want you dead. There are those among my kind who believe that we should remain pure, even if it means we fade into nothing. I've lived underground for 12 years, I replied, my anger flaring again. I've lived in a world where my own friends tried to kill me for a can of soup. I know what worse looks like. I'm not afraid of your court. His gaze softened, just a fraction. It was the first time I had seen anything approaching warmth in him. Good, he said. Then you may survive me after all. That night, he showed me the spire. We walked through the streets beneath the dome. It was a city of order and chilling efficiency. Humans walked alongside vampires, their heads lowered, their pulses exposed. I saw the blood stations clinics where humans gave their life force in exchange for luxury, for food, for a life that wasn't spent in the dirt. This is mercy, Helios said, noticing the way I looked at the long lines of donors. In the tunnels you starve. Here, they are fed, they are housed, and they are protected. All they give is a small portion of what their bodies naturally replace. I don't know if I'd call it mercy, I replied, watching a young woman walk out of a clinic with a dazed, euphoric expression. It looks like an addiction. It is, he agreed. But it is a survival. Which would you choose, the ash or the spire? I didn't answer. I knew the truth, and I hated it. Back in his private quarters, the air between us thickened once more. The tour was over, the politics were done, and the reality of our bargain began to settle in. You will sleep here, Helios said, gesturing to the massive bed. In my rooms. It is the only way to ensure your safety. My breath caught. With you? He met my gaze steadily, his eyes dark. Not yet, Jael. I am a monster, but I am not a savage. What I need from you cannot be taken by force. It must be given. A strange, unwanted disappointment flared in my chest before I could stop it. I hated myself for it. Hated the way my body felt restless and expectant in his presence. He noticed. A slow, knowing smile touched his lips, revealing the tips of his fangs. This will not be rushed, Helios said, his voice a low caress. Our bargain is a long one, and I intend to enjoy every moment of the negotiation. He stepped closer, close enough that I could feel the cold radiating from his skin, the magnetic pull of a predator. He reached out, his fingers brushing my cheek. His skin was like silk-wrapped ice. When I touch you, he murmured, his gaze dropping to my throat, it will be because you want it more than your next breath. I will not have it any other way. My pulse thundered in my ears, a frantic, rhythmic plea. Go to bed, Jael, he said softly. Tomorrow, you become something more than prey. Tomorrow, you begin to learn what it means to be a queen in a world of shadows. He turned and left the room without another word. I lay awake long into the artificial night, my body humming with a nervous, electric energy. I had agreed to a monster's bargain. I had sold my future for a breath of clean air and a golden cage. And the worst part, the part that kept me staring at the ceiling until the cycle reset, was that I wasn't sure anymore who was hunting whom. I had walked into the spire a victim, but as I looked at the door where Helios had stood, I realized that I was the only thing in this world that he truly needed. And in a world of monsters, that was the only power that mattered. Chapter 5. Blood Makes Claims. The first assassination attempt came quietly. That should have been my first warning. In a world defined by the screaming of the wind and the guttural roars of the feral dead, true danger doesn't make a sound. It doesn't announce itself with a flourish. It slides through the shadows like a silk ribbon around a throat. I had been living in Helios's city for 3 weeks, long enough for the rhythms of the dome to sink into my bones, long enough for my body to forget the hollow, gnawing ache of starvation, long enough to understand that safety here was conditional, layered, and always paid for in advance. The spire was a masterpiece of geometry and light, but beneath the polished stone lay the same cold calculus of survival I had known in the tunnels. The only difference was the quality of the predators. Helios did not touch me during those 3 weeks. That restraint was a deliberate, excruciating form of psychological warfare. He kept me close, always within reach, always within his line of sight, but he never crossed the invisible line he had drawn between us. We shared meals of real meat and fresh greens grown in the hydroponic tiers. We had long, quiet conversations about a world that had died before I was born. We took walks beneath the false sky of the dome, where the lights mimicked constellations that no one living remembered. He watched me constantly, not like a hunter watches a rabbit, but like an archivist watches a priceless, crumbling scroll. I was something valuable that could be stolen, something fragile that needed to be preserved, and something powerful that he wasn't yet sure how to wield. That knowledge settled into me, heavy and intoxicating. I began to realize that my power didn't come from my strength or my skills. It came from the fact that I was the only thing in this sterile, immortal city that could still produce life. The city learned my name. Some humans looked at me with a naked, ugly envy, as if I were a traitor who had slept her way into a palace. Others looked at me with a profound, soul-deep fear, seeing me as a lamb being fattened for a slaughter they couldn't comprehend. But the vampires? They looked at me with a clinical, terrifying calculation. I felt their gazes linger on the pulse point of my throat, the delicate blue veins of my wrists, and the steady, rhythmic thrum of my heart. I belonged to Helios. In the spire that was supposed to make me untouchable. I was wrong. The attempt came when I was alone, a rare moment of solitude I had fought for. I had insisted on small freedoms, moments without the armored guards hovering at my shoulder like statues. Helios had allowed it, reluctantly, his trust measured out in drops. I was in one of the inner corridors, returning from the garden levels reserved for the high-tier humans, when the air shifted. The golden light of the wall panels dimmed, flickering once, twice, before settling into a bruised, sickly violet. A figure stepped from the shadows. She was beautiful in the way a storm is beautiful, destructive and absolute. Her skin was the color of moonlight on water, and her hair was a spill of ink down her back. She was familiar in the way nightmares are familiar. You don't remember meeting them, you only remember the cold they leave behind. She smiled at me, her lips pulling back to reveal fangs that were longer and sharper than Helios's. Human, she purred. Her voice was like dry leaves skittering over a grave. You walk very freely for a piece of livestock. I didn't scream. I didn't run. The tunnels had taught me that predators love the chase, and I refused to give her the satisfaction. I'm not livestock, I said, my voice cold and even. And you're trespassing in a sector that doesn't belong to you. Her eyes flicked over me, sharp and assessing. She inhaled deeply, her nostrils flaring. You smell untouched. All this fuss for a girl who hasn't even been tasted yet. It was a lie. Not in the way she meant. Helios hadn't claimed my body, but he had claimed my mind, my safety, and my future. Her hand moved fast, faster than any human could possibly track. It was a blur of white light aiming for my throat. But she never reached me. Helios appeared between us like a blade drawn from a scabbard. The impact was tectonic. Stone cracked beneath their feet. The vampire woman was thrown backward by a burst of pure kinetic force, slamming into the obsidian wall hard enough to fracture the masonry. Helios didn't hesitate. He didn't offer a warning. He didn't demand an explanation. He moved with a brutal, terrifying efficiency that made his previous gentleness with me feel like a dream. He caught her before she could hit the floor, his hand wrapping around her throat. With a single, sickeningly wet movement, he tore her head from her shoulders. The sound was final. Absolute. Blood sprayed the wall in a dark, steaming arc, looking like spilled ink against the stone. I stood frozen, my heart pounding against my ribs like a trapped bird. As the headless body collapsed bonelessly to the floor, Helios turned to me slowly. His eyes were lit, not with the red madness of the ferals, but with a cold, molten fury that seemed to radiate heat. He was breathing heavily, his chest heaving, his hands stained with a dark, thick ichor that wasn't human. You were not supposed to be alone, he said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. I asked for this, I replied quietly, my voice shaking despite my best efforts. I wanted to breathe without someone watching me. That does not make it wise, Jael, he snapped, stepping toward me. He reached for me, his hand stopping just an inch from my cheek. He was trembling, not with fear, but with a restraint so powerful it looked painful. Did she touch you? Did her skin meet yours? No, I whispered. The tension in his shoulders eased, just a fraction. He looked down at the corpse on the floor with a disgust so profound it was almost tangible. She was ancient, Helios said, his voice regaining its icy composure. A remnant of the old ways, before the spire. She was part of a faction that believes humans are a resource to be exhausted, not preserved. Why try to kill me now? I asked. What changed? His jaw tightened, the muscles ticking. Because word has spread, because you matter to the future of this city, and because killing you is the only way to strike at me. The words sank deep. I wasn't just a partner in a bargain. I was a target. That night, the city went into a total lockdown. The golden lights were replaced by a harsh, sweeping red. Helios summoned the other ancients, the high lords of the spire who governed the sectors beneath him. They arrived at dawn, or what passed for dawn in a world of black clouds. There were 3 of them, and each one made the air in the room feel heavy and toxic. First was Cassian, a man with eyes like polished steel and a lazy, arrogant smile that promised betrayal before he even spoke. Then there was Nyx, tall and elegant, her presence colder and more remote than Helios's ever was. Finally, there was Varro, a massive, scarred warrior who said nothing, his gaze lingering on my wrists with an open, predatory hunger. So this is the human, Cassian said, his voice light and mocking. He circled me, his eyes raking over my tunic. She looks breakable. Are you sure she can survive the transition, Helios? It would be a shame to waste such a pretty throat on a failed experiment. She is not yours to evaluate, Cassian, Helios replied, his voice a warning that should have silenced the room. Cassian laughed, a sharp, barking sound. No. But she could be. We all know the laws. If you cannot produce an heir, the spire goes to the strongest. And I am feeling very strong lately. That was the moment I truly understood the trap I was in. I wasn't just leverage for a future. I was a catalyst for a civil war. You've grown sentimental, Helios, Nyx observed coolly, her voice like ice chips. You keep her in silk. You let her walk the gardens. That makes you weak. It makes the city doubt your resolve. Helios didn't deny it. He stood beside me, his hand resting on the hilt of a sword I hadn't seen him wear before. She is under my protection. Any harm that comes to her, any look that lingers too long, will be answered in blood. Is that understood? Varro tilted his head, his eyes narrowing. And what of the heir? Has the seed been planted, or are we fighting over a barren field? A heavy, suffocating silence fell over the room. I turned sharply to Helios, my heart stopping. You told them? You told them about the child? They would have known, Helios said quietly, his eyes fixed on the ancients. Secrets do not live long among immortals. They smell the change in the air. Cassian's smile widened, revealing a row of perfect, lethal teeth. Then it's already begun. The countdown to a new era. The rebellion ignited that same night. It wasn't a riot, it was a systematic dismantling. Power stations in the lower tiers were sabotaged. Blood depots were destroyed, sending hundreds of controlled vampires into a starving frenzy. Humans were caught in the middle, used as bait to draw Helios's loyalists into the dark. The spire was no longer a sanctuary. It was a slaughterhouse. I watched Helios transform. The cold, aristocratic ruler vanished, and the ancient warrior returned. He donned armor that looked older than the city itself. Dark, heavy metal etched with the same symbols I had seen in the temple. It was a knight's armor, but it fit him like a second skin. You need to go to the vault, he told me, his voice hard and devoid of emotion. The guards will take you. Stay there until I come for you. I'm not hiding in a box while the city burns, I said, my anger flaring. This is not bravery, Jael. It is foolishness, he snapped, grabbing my shoulders. His grip was strong enough to bruise, his eyes burning with a desperate, frantic light. If they get to you, it's over. Everything we've built, everything I've lived for, ends with you. You promised me a choice, I replied, looking him dead in the eye. I choose to stay here. If I'm the prize, then I'll be here when you win it. Something unreadable crossed his face, a mixture of agony and a fierce, terrifying pride. He nodded once, a sharp, jerky movement. Then, he kissed me. It wasn't the gentle, restrained kiss of a man who was waiting. It was a desperate, violent claim. It tasted of salt, iron, and a hunger that had been suppressed for centuries. His mouth claimed mine like a vow, his hands gripping my waist with a territorial intensity that made my head spin. It was the kiss of a man who didn't know if he would ever breathe again. When he pulled back, his forehead rested against mine. We were both gasping for air. If I do not return, he whispered, his voice cracking. You will, I said, my voice fierce. You're too arrogant to die, Helios. His eyes darkened, the amber turning to liquid fire. If I return, nothing between us remains unclaimed. The bargain ends, and the life begins. Do you understand? My breath hitched. My heart was a frantic drum. Then come back, I whispered. Come back and claim it. He did come back, but he was barely alive. The battle for the spire lasted 2 days. From the windows of the high quarters, I watched the violet lights of the city flicker and die, replaced by the orange glow of fires that the dome couldn't suppress. I heard the screams, both human and immortal, echoing through the vents. By the time Helios returned to me, he was a ghost of the man he had been. His armor was shattered, hanging from his frame in jagged pieces. His skin was gray, and he was covered in a thick black ichor, his own blood, and the blood of those he had slaughtered. He collapsed the moment he crossed the threshold of the room, his sword clattering to the floor. I rushed to him, catching him before his head hit the stone. He was impossibly heavy, a weight of cold, solid muscle. I told you to leave, he rasped, his eyes fluttering. And I told you that you don't get to die, I said, my voice shaking with a mixture of terror and relief. I dragged him toward the bed, my muscles screaming under his weight. I didn't care about the silk or the blood. I just needed him to stay. I climbed onto the bed beside him, my hands pressing against the gashes in his chest. His blood was thick and cold, staining my fingers, my tunic, my life. Jael, he warned, his voice a broken whisper. I am starving. The battle, the wounds, the hunger is uncontrolled. Get away from me. No, I whispered. I looked down at him, seeing the monster and the man intertwined. I saw the desperation in his eyes, the way his fangs were fully extended, his body trembling with the need to feed, to heal, to survive. I leaned down, my lips brushing his ear. You said you wouldn't take from me, I whispered. But you didn't say you wouldn't accept what I give. The hunger in his eyes became something else, something reverent, something holy. Once I begin, he said, his voice a low, vibrating growl, I may not be able to stop. The darkness, it wants everything. Then don't stop, I replied. I didn't offer him my throat. I didn't offer him my blood. I offered him me. What followed was not violence. It was a total, devastating surrender. Heat chased away the crystalline cold of the room. Power met consent in a way that defied every law of the tunnels and the spire. Centuries of ironclad restraint unraveled, not in a chaotic explosion, but in a slow, aching release. He didn't drink from me. Not once. Even in his delirium, even in his starvation, he kept that part of the bargain. He healed through the contact, through the strange, ancient resonance of my blood that he had spoken of. We became a closed loop of energy, a bridge built in the middle of a war zone. When it was over, when the world had narrowed down to the sound of our mingled breathing, he held me like I was the only solid thing in a universe of smoke. His skin was no longer ice cold. It was warm, humming with a borrowed life. "I have doomed you, Jael," he said quietly, his face buried in the crook of my neck. "I have tied you to a ghost." "I chose the ghost," I replied, my fingers tracing the silver scars on his back. The ash was already a grave. This is something else." Weeks later, the city was quiet again. The scars of the rebellion were being paved over with new stone and fresh light. Cassian was a memory. Varro had fled into the wastes. Nyx had vanished into the deeper ruins, a shadow waiting for a new opportunity. The healer came to the private quarters on a morning when the fall sun was particularly bright. She was a woman of 80 who had seen the world before the fall, and her hands trembled as she checked my vitals. "You carry life," she said, her voice filled with a hushed, terrified awe. It is unlike anything I have seen, a child of blood and sunless fire." Helios said nothing. He was standing by the window, looking out at his kingdom. But when he heard the words, he turned. He didn't speak. He didn't celebrate. He simply walked to where I sat and knelt before me. He pressed his forehead to my stomach, his eyes closing. For the first time, he looked at peace. The city learned the news soon after. The whispers changed. The envy turned to a strange, religious dread. The war was not over. Nyx was still out there, and the tunnels were still dying, and the sky was still black. But as I looked down at the king of monsters kneeling at my feet, I realized that the shape of the war had changed. We weren't just fighting for survival anymore. We were fighting for the first new thing the world had seen in 10 years, and I would burn the spire to the ground before I let anyone take it from us. Chapter 6. When the darkness learned to breathe, the child moved for the first time beneath my ribs on a night without stars. I had grown used to the weight of the spire, the way the massive obsidian walls felt less like a fortress and more like a living organism. I had grown used to the artificial sky, that shimmering veil of violet and gold that glowed overhead like a fading memory rather than a promise of morning. But that night, as I stood at the reinforced glass of the high balcony, overlooking the sprawling, orderly tiers of Helios's city, I felt something shift, a sudden, electric flutter that originated deep within me and echoed into the very air. It wasn't a kick. It was a ripple. A pulse. Life. I pressed my palm to the soft fabric of my tunic, feeling the slight swell of my stomach, and exhaled slowly. I grounded myself, focusing on the cool air entering my lungs, just as Helios had taught me. The healer, a human woman named Martha who had been a midwife in the old world before the ash took the sun, had told me the child was strong. She didn't use words like vampire or human. She just looked at me with watery, aged eyes and whispered that I was carrying a miracle. The child was a paradox. Ancient, predatory blood woven with something stubbornly, beautifully human. Hope, perhaps, or perhaps just the sheer will to exist in a world that had tried to extinguish us both. Behind me, the shadows stirred. I didn't need to turn to know he was there. Helios moved with a silence that was absolute, but I could feel the temperature in the room drop, the air sharpening with his proximity. He had changed since the Great Rebellion. He hadn't softened. Helios was a creature of flint and shadow, and he would never be anything else, but he had sharpened. He was like a blade that had been broken, and then reforged in a hotter fire. The rebellion of the other ancients had stripped away the last of his illusions about the cost of order. Nyx remained at large, a ghost in the ruins, and Varro had vanished into the ash-choked wastes, reportedly gathering an army of ferals who refused to live under a ruler who shared his bed with a human. But Helios no longer ruled alone. He no longer ruled out of a sense of grim, immortal duty. He ruled with something to lose, and that terrified his enemies far more than his strength ever had. "You're thinking too loudly again, Jael," he said. His voice was a low, melodic rasp that sent a familiar shiver down my spine. I smiled faintly at our reflection in the glass. "And you're listening too closely." He crossed the room, his long strides effortless, and stood behind me. He didn't touch me at first. He never assumed his welcome. He waited until I leaned back against his chest, feeling the solid, cool strength of him. His hands, large and scarred, came around to rest over mine on my stomach. "The outer districts are ready," he said. "The gates will open tomorrow. For the people from my tunnels," I whispered. "Yes. And the surrounding outposts. If they can reach the perimeter, they will be granted entry." That single word carried centuries of consequence. After the rebellion, I had made it my primary condition. If I was to be the mother of his heir, the spire could no longer be a closed tomb for the elite. It had to become a sanctuary for the species that was currently being hunted to extinction. He invited them as citizens. not as bloodstock. The remaining vampires had protested. Helios had listened to every word, his expression as unmoving as stone, and then he had acted anyway. He did it because he knew that the child I carried was not just his heir, but the blueprint for the only future we had left. They will be afraid, I said. Fear is a rational response, Helios replied. But they will also be fed. They will see that the monsters are no longer hunting them. But the world was never that simple. I learned the horrific truth of the outside world 3 days later. A runner arrived at the city gates, a man I recognized from my own block in the tunnels. His name was Elias. He was coated in a layer of gray ash, so thick, it looked like he was made of stone. His eyes were wide, white circles of shock. "Jail," he wheezed, clutching at the bars of the inner gate. "Jail, is that you?" I rushed to the gate, ignoring the guard's warnings. "Elias? What happened? Where are the others?" His breath hitched, a wet, rattling sound. "They came back. Riven, Mara, Chet, they showed up at the airlocks 2 nights ago. We thought they were scavenging. We thought they had found a way to survive the surface." My heart clenched. "They were screaming for us to open up," Elias wept. "They said they were being hunted. We knew them, Jail. They were our neighbors. Our friends. We opened the gates to let them in. I already knew." The image formed in my mind with brutal clarity. "They weren't being hunted," Elias said, his voice breaking. "They were changed. Their eyes, Jail. They were already turned. They didn't come home to save us. They came home to feed." They led the ferals straight into the residential shafts. They used their knowledge of the layout to trap everyone in the lower levels. The tunnels, my home, had become a slaughterhouse. Riven and the others, in their desperate cowardice, had traded the location of the colony for a chance at a new life under the command of the ferals. They had betrayed their own kind twice over. The tunnels had fallen. Everyone I had ever known had been consumed by the very people they trusted to protect them. I did not cry. I sat in the high garden long after Elias was taken to the infirmary. I mourned my mother, but I did not mourn Riven or Mara. Their selfishness had finally provided the key that unlocked the door to their own extinction. "The ferals are being led," Helios said that night. "They are no longer hunting for food. They are hunting for the spire. Nyx has promised them your blood." The final war came with a silence so absolute, it felt like the world had stopped breathing. The dome's perimeter sensors began to flare, registering a mass of movement so vast it looked like a literal shadow was swallowing the earth. Thousands of ferals. And at the center was Nyx. She appeared at the main gates alone, her pale form illuminated by the white-hot defensive lights. "Helios," her voice boomed, "give us the bridge and I will let your city stand." Helios stood on the battlements, his dark armor gleaming. I stood beside him, my hand resting on the stone. "I chose the future, Nyx," Helios shouted back. Nyx's answer was a shriek that shattered the glass in the watchtowers. The ferals surged forward, a wave of gray flesh and snapping teeth. The battle was a descent into hell. I watched as the ferals used their own dead as ramps, piling bodies against the gates. "I need you to go to the vault," Helios told me, drawing his sword. "No," I said. I threw back my cloak, revealing the swell of my stomach. "I am the reason they are here. And I am the only reason they will fail." I closed my eyes and reached inward, not for my own strength, but for the humming, golden presence of the life within me. The healer, Martha, had said this child felt like. I stepped forward onto the very edge of the battlements, raising my hands. The world went silent. It wasn't a physical silence, but a psychic one. Every feral below us froze in mid-lunge. Nyx screamed, falling to her knees, clutching her chest. "What are you?" she snarled. I opened my eyes. They weren't brown anymore. They were glowing with the same golden light as the veins in the ceiling. "I am the end of your hunger," I said. The child's presence surged outward, a wave of pure, stabilizing energy. It wasn't an attack, it was a command. The ferals didn't just stop, they collapsed, their broken minds short-circuiting as the madness was forcibly suppressed by the pulse of a pure heartbeat. Nyx was the only one left standing, her power flickering. Helios didn't hesitate. He leapt from the battlements. The clash lasted only seconds. Helios's blade caught the light as it swung in a perfect, lethal arc. Nyx was dead before she hit the ground. I felt the light within me recede, leaving me cold. Helios appeared beside me, catching me in his arms. "You terrified me," he whispered. "Good," I panted. "You were getting too comfortable." The weeks that followed were a blur. The spire opened its gates wide. The survivors from the surrounding tunnels and outposts poured in. They were met with bread and medicine. The rigid hierarchy began to melt. Vampires began to look at humans not as prey, but as the only thing keeping them from the void. The first hybrid children began to be conceived in the months that followed. A new race. Stronger than humans, more stable than vampires. The curse of the Templars was finally beginning to unravel. I sat in the garden on the day my daughter was born. We named her Alara. She didn't cry. She simply opened her eyes, amber eyes, and looked at the world. When Helios held her, he wept. I stood beside him, no longer the terrified girl from the tunnels. The world is still dark. The sun may never return, but beneath the domes, life is thriving. Hope has become as vital as oxygen. The darkness did not win. It simply provided the canvas for a new kind of light. And the monsters? They learned at last that while blood makes claims, it is the heart that chooses the future. End.